30,000 ICP figure is doing the rounds at the minute, and it's being read wrong. And that's the kind of purpose of this video. So we're going to go through what Doxa USD has actually proposed, why that number isn't what most people actually think that it is, and what it could do and couldn't do to ICP liquidity if the thing ever goes ahead. So welcome back to the channel, welcome back to another walk and talk style video, although I am actually sat down here. But this is where I just grab the camera, we get out of the studio and we just talk to you in a kind of raw, uncut, unfiltered kind of way. Today we are actually by the woods, but I've actually come out here to a bit of a quiet area just to kind of sit down and get out of the sun and kind of just talk to you about what's going on with ICP. And anyone who is new to the channel, first of all, hi and welcome. My name is Nick, and this is just one of those segments where I just pick up the camera and we just get out of the studio and we talk about what's going on in crypto. So today's subject is that 300,000 number attached to Doxa USD's proposed SNS. And I do want to start with the one word that just keeps getting deleted every single time that this thing actually gets shared. The word is proposed. Because if you take that word out, right, the number, it sounds dramatic. It sounds like 300,000 ICP is about to disappear, off of the liquid market. And that's not what's actually happened. See, nothing has been raised through this proposed SNS. Nothing has been locked because of it. And there's no guarantee that a maximum will ever actually reach at all. So what we've got is a proposed decentralized structure with a direct participation parameter that's running a minimum of 50,000 to 300,000, or at least a minimum of 50,000 ICP, all the way up to a maximum of 300,000 ICP. Right? And minimum and maximum. Those are the two words doing all of the work right here. So the question, it isn't that 300,000 ICP has been locked, because it hasn't, right? The question that I'm more interested in is this one. If the SNS, goes ahead, and if enough people take part, and if ICP moves out of freely available holdings and into the resulting treasury structure, what could that temporarily do to the amount of ICP sitting liquid and available elsewhere? Now that's the interesting bit. And there's another detail that's buried in the kind of discussion that makes it a fair bit messier than people are actually letting on. You see, that's 8 years. But we're going to come back to that. But the first we kind of need to understand what people are actually being asked to take part in, right? You see, Doxa USD is connected to a wider Doxa project that is being built on the internet computer. And on August the 1st, the team actually put up details on the Internet Computer Developer Forum describing an upcoming Doxa Service Nervous System, or SNS. The proposal listed a Genesis supply of 10 million Doxa tokens and a decentralization sale involving 3% of that supply, which is 300,000 Doxa. Now, we do have to be careful here, because there are two completely different 300,000 numbers in this story. Right, 300,000 Doxa is the proposed Doxa allocation for a decentralization sale. 300,000 ICP is the proposed maximum direct ICP participation. It's a different asset, different thing entirely, and blending those two together is exactly how a fairly boring proposal turns into a completely misleading social media post. Now, the published parameters, they had minimum direct participation at 50,000 ICP, and the maximum was set at 300,000 ICP. The minimum individual contribution, that was 25 ICP. The maximum from any one participant was set at 30,000 ICP. The swap duration listed as 21 days, and no neurons fund participation is listed. So, how does an SNS actually work then? Well, it's basically just a way for an application on the internet computer to move towards community token governance. Now, the official ICP documentation, it explains that when an SNS, a decentralization swap, opens, people can send ICP into that swap. And if the process, succeeds, participants receive a proportional allocation of the SNS asset through neurons, and the ICP that was collected becomes part of the SNS treasury. But there's a minimum threshold, right? And if that minimum is not reached before the swap closes, then the swap fails and the ICP is refunded. Now, that sentence matters more than almost anything else that I'm going to say today, because 300,000 ICP, that is a ceiling. It is not a confirmed transaction, it is not an existing treasury balance, and it is not evidence of 300,000 ICP walking off of the exchanges. It is simply the maximum proposed direct participation, and that is it. So here is my first question for you then, right? When you first saw 300,000 ICP, did you assume that amount had already been committed or locked? So you can drop me a comment down below, because if you did, then you can see exactly why the wording matters. And now we can get to the part that actually created the real confusion. You see, the original Forum post said that 70% of the ICP raised during the decentralization swap would actually be locked in an 8-year NNS neuron that is controlled by the DAO, with some of the staking rewards intended to actually support Doxa USD staking yields. Now, if you read that quickly, and the kind of obvious conclusion is, right, if 300,000 ICP comes in, well, 70% of it gets locked for 8 years. And the math on that is, well, easy enough. 70% of 300,000 is 210,000 ICP. But I'm also deliberately not telling you that 210,000 ICP is going to be getting locked for 8 years, because the discussion actually moved on. On August the 3rd, after questions were raised on the forum, a response from the proposal author said that the language had been changed. It had actually clarified that 70% would go to the treasury. So we've got to be careful with that. There was an 8-year neuron structure discussed in the published material, and there was a later clarification around the wording of the 70% allocation. So we shouldn't be collapsing those two things, I guess, into a definitive statement that 70% of the future 300,000 ICP raise is going to be guaranteed to sit untouched for 8 years. See, that goes beyond what we can actually establish here. And this is the problem with the crypto headlines generally, right? One number gets copied, somebody strips out the conditions of it, and then somebody else turns maximum participation into ICP being locked. And within a couple of hours, a possibility has actually become a certainty. But you're not one of those kind of degenerates on social media. You're an investor. So you need the boring little words that social media loves to delete out. See, if, right, that's the word. And if the SNS proceeds, if the minimum participation requirement is met, if people actually contribute, if the treasury structure develops the way that the proposal and the governance decisions say that it will, then we can start talking about the impact on liquid ICP. And that conversation is a lot more interesting than simply shouting 300,000 ICP locked at people from a Twitter account. Now, I do also have to kind of be honest with you guys about something. I'm not an artificial intelligence avatar, right? I am a real person in the middle of a field, as you can kind of see, right? The woods over in that direction. Now, the other thing I need to be honest with you about is that I'm not a financial advisor, right? This video is for informational and educational purposes only. The crypto market's volatile, you could lose everything, and you need to do your own research because your money is your responsibility and not mine. And while we're on the subject of doing your own research, if you do want somewhere to track assets like ICP with other people, well, the free Discord is linked in the description down below. Right, let's get back to it, because we still haven't answered the important question. What would actually happen to ICP liquidity if people actually did take part? So just imagine that you own 1,000 ICP. Right now, I guess you've kind of got how do I tick this, right? So let's get rid of some of that dirt on the screen. Let's imagine that you've got 1,000 ICP right now. You've got options with it, right? You could hold it in a wallet, you could sell it, you could move it to an exchange, you could stake it, you could move it to another application, right? The point is that the ICP stays available for whatever you decide to do with it next. Now let's just imagine that you take part of that ICP and then you commit it to a successful SNS decentralization swap. With that ICP, it changes role, right? Now, under the standard SNS launch process, ICP that's collected through a successful swap becomes SNS treasury ICP. So now it's not sitting in your wallet waiting for you to sell it tomorrow morning. You've received the SNS asset allocation through the structure of the SNS neurons instead. And that's the mechanism that people should actually be paying attention to here. Not because ICP magically disappears, because, well, it doesn't. The ICP, it still exists. But ownership, control, and immediate availability can change. And that difference between total supply and liquid supply is where all of the confusion lives. You see, if coins move away from holders who are willing to sell them and into treasury-controlled structures, well, those coins can become less immediately available to the open market. Now, that can temporarily reduce the liquid supply, but you're going to notice the wording again, right? This isn't me saying that it will happen, and it's me saying that it could, and temporarily, not permanently, right? Because treasuries can deploy assets later depending on their governance rules and whatever kind of gets approved. ICP can move, right? Governance makes decisions, conditions can change. So this, it is not a burn, right? It is not the same as permanently destroying ICP, and it shouldn't be described that way, right? It's better understood as a possible change in where some of the ICP sits and how immediately available it actually is. Now that sounds like a rather small distinction, except it isn't, right? Because markets, they trade at the margins, right? The price that you're looking at on your screen, it isn't created by every single ICP token in existence that's being offered for sale at the same time. The price is discovered through the supply and the demand available in the market at that particular moment. So if an ecosystem keeps giving holders reasons to move away from immediately liquid positions, well, that is actually worth tracking. One small SNS, it isn't going to tell you the whole entire story, but the mechanism is actually worth understanding. And this is also why I always kind of talk about the exchange redundancy rather than just relying on one platform, right? Now, my main go-to exchanges these days are Kraken, BitGet, Blowfin, with backups at Binance, Coinbase, and so forth. But I simply just prefer to get signed up with multiple tier 1 exchanges where available, because access, liquidity, and platform conditions, they can change. Now, if you want to set up your own exchange redundancy strategy, check out the pinned comment down below and the description of the video for a list of all of the exchanges that I am currently using. Now, we need to get to the darker side of this, because reduced liquid supply, that sounds automatically bullish, right? But it isn't. Now, here is the trap that people fall into. Someone sees this proposal and goes, less liquid ICP equals higher ICP price. Done. The case, that's closed. Except markets, they don't really work that neatly, do they? Right? Reducing the immediately available supply of an asset can matter, but it's only really one side of the equation, right? The other side is demand. So you could remove an enormous amount of sell-side liquidity from the market, and if the buyers disappear faster, the price can still fall. So you can also have plenty of tokens available for sale and watch the price completely rip if the demand overwhelms that supply. So the question that's around is actually, the question around a successful Doxa or Doxa SNS wouldn't actually just be how much ICP went into it. I'd also want to kind of know where that ICP came from, right? Was it ICP that participants were going to hold anyway? Was it kind of bought specifically to take part in this? And did that create extra market demand? See, that maybe even how was the treasury managed afterwards, and how liquid did those kind of treasury assets stay. So that is one of what decides whether this ends up as economically meaningful or just an interesting little headline. There's also another misconception that is probably worth clearing up here as well. You see, an SNS treasury holding ICP is not the same thing as every ICP being locked in an NNS neuron. Right? The official SNS documentation describes the collected ICP becoming the SNS treasury after a successful decentralization swap. And treasury management then sits within governance, with treasury and asset management actions handled through proposals, which is kind of why the change in the wording around Doxa's original 8-year statement deserves your attention. See, we've got an initial published structure discussing an 8-year NNS neuron, and then we've got the proposal 𝗤𝗓 saying that the language was changed and that 70% would actually go to the Treasury. So those details actually need following as the proposal develops here, not just guessed at, but followed. And if you do want to understand, market structure, blockchain mechanics, fundamental analysis in a more structured format, well, the Cheeky School over at 𝗕𝗘𝗪𝗏.com, we've got some free courses to get you started. Those were created with AI, by the way. And there's also the courses that we have made ourselves, plus a 50% off discount code in the description below for any of those. Because knowing the difference between circulating supply, liquid supply, state supply, and treasury holdings makes stories like this a lot easier to actually judge. Now here is my next question for you. If the SNS eventually attracts substantial ICP participation, do you see treasury-held ICP as genuinely reduced market supply, or simply supply that has moved somewhere else? Now that distinction is going to matter, so do let me know how you see it in the comments below, because now we can finally come back to our headline. Start with what we know. Doxa published plans for an SNS. The published direct participation range was 50,000 to 300,000 ICP, with a swap duration listed as 21 days. The proposal initially discussed a structure where 70% of the raised ICP was allocated with an 8-year NNS neuron, and after questions on the forum, the author said that the language had been changed and clarified that 70% would go to the Treasury. And under the standard SNS process, if the minimum threshold for a decentralization swap isn't reached, well, the swap fails and the contributed ICP is then refunded. Now here is what we don't know. Right, we don't know that 300,000 ICP will be contributed, or that the maximum will be reached. We shouldn't be saying 300,000 ICP has already been locked, and we shouldn't be assuming that every ICP contributed would be unavailable for 8 years. On the information that is available while I'm making this video, the evidence just simply doesn't let us say that. But the proposal is still relevant here because it is, at least if it proceeds successfully, the people who kind of contribute meaningful amounts of ICP, then some ICP that was previously controlled directly by individual participants moves into the SNS treasury structure. And depending on how that treasury gets managed, some of that ICP could be less liquid for a period of time. You see, that is the actual story, right? Not a guaranteed supply shock, not 300,000 ICP, disappearing overnight, and not an automatic price catalyst either. Just a potential shift in liquidity, and another example of what successful applications on the internet computer can potentially do with native assets. And that is where the bigger question starts. If one application can pull ICP into an SNS treasury, what happens when dozens of applications start competing for ICP participation? At that point, we're not talking about just one proposal anymore, we're talking about an ecosystem mechanism. Now, the Internet Computer's official dashboard already tracks numerous launched SNS DAOs, so this model isn't theoretical. The SNS structures are being used across different applications, with treasury balances varying dramatically from project to project. But even then, we've got to resist turning a mechanism into a guaranteed market outcome. More SNS activity doesn't automatically equal higher ICP price. More treasury ICP doesn't automatically create scarcity. And long dissolve delays don't mean that those assets stop existing. What it gives us is another metric worth watching. How much ICP is freely liquid? How much is sitting inside governance structures? How much is state? How much is held by application treasuries? And the one that actually decides it is demand for the network growing alongside all of that. See, that's what separates meaningful economic shift from an interesting token movement. So, next time that somebody kind of posts that 300,000 ICP is being locked because of Doxa USD, remember what we've gone through here. 300,000 ICP is the proposed maximum direct participation amount. It isn't proof that 300,000 ICP has been raised, and it isn't proof that anything has actually been removed from circulation. And given the clarification around the Treasury wording, we should be especially careful about claiming any fixed portion of that theoretical maximum is going to be guaranteed to be locked away for 8 years. Right? The strong story is actually a lot more subtle, right? And frankly also more useful to us. Doxa USD is proposing an SNS structure that could attract between 50,000 and 300,000 ICP in direct participation if it proceeds successfully. A successful SNS would move contributed ICP into a treasury-controlled environment, and depending on how those assets get managed afterwards, that could temporarily reduce the amount of ICP immediately available for those participants. The 8-year neuron discussion tells us long-term treasury management has clearly been part of the conversation, even if we shouldn't treat every proposal detail as completed transaction. Now that's the difference between analyzing crypto and simply just advertising crypto. See, we follow what has happened, we separate it from what could happen, and then we watch the conditions that would actually have to be met for the possibility to turn into reality. So don't fixate on the 300,000 ICP just because it's a big number. Watch whether the SNS proposal formally progresses and what the final parameter looks like. Watch whether participation actually opens and whether that 50,000 ICP minimum gets reached. Watch how much ICP genuinely goes in, and then watch what governance does with the treasury afterwards. Because if nothing is raised, there's no 300,000 ICP supply story. If 50,000 is raised, well, that's the story. If 120,000 is raised, well, that's the story. And if the maximum 300,000 does eventually get reached, then we analyze what actually happened to those coins instead of pretending that we knew beforehand. Right now, the headline number is a possibility. The mechanism behind it is real, and for ICP holders, knowing the difference between those two things is worth a lot more than believing the loudest version of the story. And if you found this useful and informative, you can do me a massive favor by hitting that like button. It costs you absolutely nothing, but means an awful lot to us here on the channel. And if you haven't done so yet, don't forget to subscribe. And I'll catch you all in the next one.